guard my feet while I run this race. Guard my feet while I run this race.
Welcome to session 2 of Be the Bridge 101 as we talk tonight about white identity. Glad to have you here. If you have questions over the course of my talk, feel free to send them in. Now, over these next 4 sessions, we're going to be looking at what Latasha Morrison terms the 4 W's: white identity, white privilege, white fragility, and white supremacy. Now, perhaps the place to start is by admitting that it is very challenging to use such descriptions without having an emotional response, perhaps even a fight or flight kind of response. I would urge you tonight to be aware of your reactions and also to be open to listen as carefully as you can to what these W's describe. Too often, I think we shut down and we go into a reactive mode rather than slow down so that we can move into responsive mode whenever we are talking about something like white identity. As Latasha Morrison says on page 10 in the closing paragraph, this exercise is not about blame, but about identifying and accepting responsibility to help fix what has been broken. It can be tempting to walk away from conversations about racism and live in denial rather than face our complicity. But if we can push through the discomfort, we can gain a vision for capitalizing on our identity as white people in order to bring about a more just society and be a source of good in God's world. I admit that when asked the question on page 9, what does it mean for you to be white? I struggled to answer. I struggled to come up with my white identity. Now, I don't look in the mirror and see a white person who's part of a racial group. I just see Dave, who will walk out the door in the morning and look just like most of the people he will meet, and who may or may not see any points of contact or similarity. I don't tend to look at another white person and think, there goes another white person. In most groups, being white, being male, and heterosexual are not identity markers for me because they've been so normalized and given prominence in our society. Whereas to be black or female or homosexual would be an ever-present thumbprint of my identity. Now, you ask me identity questions, and I might say Norwegian ancestry, with the requisite Dala sweaters, love of Lefse, conversations about lutefisk, my introversion and my humorless persona. Or I might respond that I have a Lutheran identity, I'm a Minnesotan, I would say that proudly. Or I might say I'm a pastor, a husband, a father, but I would have never come up with white as being part of my identity, certainly not on my own. I love my culture, I love my identity, and I even see them as strengths most days. I recall hearing a speaker talk about being like me, a white heterosexual male Christian in America. He was also not aware of that as an identity, except perhaps when it was challenged. As he reflected upon and came to a greater awareness and appreciation of his white identity, he also came to recognize that others daily were faced with how they differed from him and from the majority. He said a gay colleague probably would not feel free to post pictures of his or her partner for fear of how coworkers might respond. A person of another religion has to deal with the fact that work holidays are established around the Christian calendar and avoid theirs. A woman in leadership may feel pressures to adapt, to fit into what was or is still predominantly a male culture, conform to male expectations. A person of color may face questions of whether or not they got the job because they were the most qualified, or if it was simply because of their race. As this man became more aware and appreciative of his own identity, he found that he grew in attentiveness and respect for the identity of others. For the most part, I don't have to deal with reactions to my identity every time I step out the door or find myself out in the community. I know that's not true for many in our society. It may be the color of someone's skin or their distinctive dress, like a burqa, a yarmulke, a kafia, that causes them to stand out from the majority, result in their being treated or responded to differently, maybe expose them to possible prejudice or taunts. If you were to ask them to describe or define a white identity, I venture to say they would very likely have something to offer. Author Toni Morrison says that in this country, American means white. Everybody else has to hyphenate. African American, Asian American, Native American. Whiteness is seen to be the norm, and everything else is measured against it. Everything else seen as other. Now, certainly, white people can also be marginalized, disrespected, discriminated against, or face hardship and oppression, but not because of their race. We are insulated, for the most part, from that kind of race-based stress. Before going further, I want to share one other observation that came to me while reflecting on what it means to me to have a white identity. Part of me wants to say white identity is too large a category and denies me my uniqueness by lumping me in with Germans and Italians, French and Swiss, British, Dutch, Danes, and God forbid, even Swedes. Now, to do so doesn't seem to me to fully honor the distinctiveness and the richness of all those cultures. To think of how we've benefited by the variety, uniquenesses that each brings, recognizing as well a common bond. And having said that, I realize to my own sadness and disappointment in myself how often I do that to people of other races. There are significant identity and cultural differences between a Mexican, a Guatemalan, and a Colombian. And yet how often do I see them as having this singular identity? And I don't take the time to recognize or appreciate the cultural differences. Or do it with Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans, Kenyans, Nigerians, Somalis, Malawians, Lakota, Apache, Crow, Cherokee. How often, I ask myself, have I failed to learn, failed to ask questions about or celebrate the unique and diverse cultures of others, instead of settling for calling them all Latinx, Asian, African, or Native American? Sadder still, I find myself sometimes assuming any Central American is Mexican. Any Asian person is probably Chinese. Or any Black person has ancestors who obviously came from Africa. Now, most folks take their identity very personally and have a fair sense of pride. They want it to be noted, respected, and valued, seen as a positive contribution to the human community. What I've learned is that I show honor and respect by getting to know them, learn about and from them, value those differences. As Latasha Morrison writes in our materials, the goal of this session is not to cause you or me to feel guilt for having a white identity, but to create awareness that being white is part of who we are. It affects and shapes our daily experiences and the experiences of others of us. And it confers upon us a certain set of privileges not gifted to other races. Now, there's more on that next week as Mark Abelson and Pastor Jose Antonio Machado shares stories and experiences with you that will shed some light upon those readings and your own personal reflections. In a quote on page 8 of Be the Bridge 101 from Daniel Tatum, the tasks for whites is to develop a positive white identity based in reality, not on assumed superiority, to accept it as personally and socially significant and learn to feel good about it. Now, not in the sense of a Klan member's white pride, but in the context of a commitment to a just society. In addition to my becoming more aware of my white identity, celebrating, valuing it, I also want to be aware that being part of the majority, wielding power and influence in American society, in terms of my race, gender, and religion, comes with certain responsibilities. Like Spider-Man, Peter Parker's uncle says to him, with great power comes great responsibility. Because whether or not we're aware of our white identity, people of color are. White identity has to do with power and authority, as positions of leadership and control of systems and institutions are heavily invested with white males. Access to employment, education, opportunities, property, wealth have for so many years been managed by and at the discretion of white people. The dominant images in media, from stars to superheroes, have also been predominantly white. It defines normal in our culture. And if meaningful change is to happen in our society, if racial divides are to be overcome, it's critical that those of us who are in the majority, who control access to most avenues for power and influence, be a part of advocating and working for the change that reflects respect, honor, and equity for all races, all ethnicities, all creeds. As I shared with you last week, when I saw the image of a man holding a sign at a protest reading, "Sorry I'm late, but I had a lot to learn," I said, that describes me. And I said that for too long, I had depended on people of color to raise their voices to get my attention, that they were to educate me on what they'd experienced. And when they stopped or didn't raise the issue, I would just go back to business and life as usual. When I look back 50 years to the ordination of the first woman into our National Lutheran Church, I remember then how it was primarily women needing to raise their voices and calling to be heard. Women asking to be allowed opportunities for positions of leadership. Women challenging those biblical interpretations and traditions that had excluded them from those positions for most of our Christian history. And 50 years later, I am so grateful for the voices, the wisdom, the intelligence, and the insights that they bring to make our faith community stronger, deeply faith-filled. And I also recall how so often the church at large expected women to adapt themselves to fit those roles in a male way, to be assimilated rather than bring their own unique, prophetic, and powerful witness. Change finally comes when those like me who held the authority and power finally came alongside and agreed that their inclusion reflected more clearly God's intentions and purpose, and that their exclusion was a profound tragedy, inequitable, and making us less than whole. We were late, and we had and have so much to learn. When the Apostle Paul wrote in Galatians that in Christ Jesus we're no longer Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave or free, but that we're all one in Christ Jesus, it's beyond ridiculous to assume that Paul was advocating a one-dimensional view of human life, where we don't appreciate and enjoy, value and cherish, learn from and grow wiser by sharing the delightful and creative diversity God fashions into creation. What Paul certainly sought to do, if we read the context of these words there and elsewhere, is to challenge the way his communities were valuing and devaluing others according to their differences. There is no hierarchy in Christ's church of value according to race, gender, ethnicity, physical characteristics, abilities, or economic status. Certainly not in Jesus' eyes. And to behave as though there are is an affront to our Creator, a distortion of God's creation. In Paul's writings to his audiences in those young churches, he said to value your Jewishness does not correlate to discriminating against non-Jews. To celebrate your maleness does not require you to diminish or devalue women. To be economically bound or free has nothing to do with your worth or significance. We are all one in Christ Jesus. And I believe what Latasha Morrison is writing about relative to our working to have a healthy and esteemed view of our white identity is her conviction that when we have a healthy, grounded view of who we are and what that means for others, we can engage in healthier ways with those who are non-white or who in other ways are not like us. If we can love and know that part of ourselves that comes from our whiteness, be aware of how that is experienced by those who are not like us, and avoid detouring into arrogance and anxieties about where we stand with each other, I know we can listen more carefully to the voices of others not like us. And we can do it without growing defensive or feeling the need of staking out our turf. In these next few weeks, we will be looking at white privilege, white fragility or defensiveness, and white supremacy. Now, those conversations will all connect back to whether or not we have a healthy understanding and a healthy awareness of what it means to be white and what it means to be part of a white culture. White culture, or any culture for that matter, can become corrosive to community when feelings of anxiety and fear cause us to believe we have to defend or protect it, or we view others as threat. When we look at the contentious encounters between Jesus and the religious authorities, and the resistance, fear, and hatred that developed among those leaders, consider that they were trying to maintain and protect a system of belief and worship while under Roman domination, to counter the strong influences of Roman, Greek, and other dominant cultures. Consider that Jesus had named the privileges accorded to them by virtue of their status and accused them of using that to lord it over others rather than serve them. And consider that some among them believed that their chosenness by God conferred on them a status clearly superior and unavailable to others. As we shall see, we need to consider that through our history, white identity toxifies into white supremacy whenever it is perceived that some social change, like the abolition of slavery or increasing numbers of immigrants, threaten us in some way. There are numerous examples in the Bible of when our predecessors in faith were overwhelmingly in the minority. What we know is that when the people of Israel were defeated and taken into exile in Babylon, a very small minority, there arose a strong urge to hold on to and celebrate their identity while they were surrounded by this vast majority culture. So they compiled and wrote down their faith stories. They collected their songs into a psalm book. They wrote worship liturgies and taught their traditions, all in an effort to strengthen and celebrate, to hold on to and value their identity. When Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, he was trying to help a small group of Jesus followers navigate living in a very culturally diverse and different society with some integrity to their beliefs and traditions, to discern between what was essential and what was not. Now, if we empathize with those spiritual ancestors about the challenges they faced, and not empathize with those in the minorities today facing such challenges, I find it to be both biblically and spiritually suspect. Let me state again, the goal of this session is not to cast blame, but to get us working towards having a healthy and esteemed view of our white identities. Believing that when we have a healthy, grounded view of who we are and what that means, we can engage in healthier ways with those who are non-white, or who in other ways are not like us. If we can love and know that part of ourselves that comes from our whiteness, without detouring into arrogance and anxieties about where we stand with others, we can listen more carefully to their voices. We can better create more equitable communities and systems that value, honor, respect, and advantage all. I hope you have a great conversation with your small groups.
For I don't want to run this race in